Hey everyone, I hope that you guys are having a great summer so far and that you're having a lot of fun on your summer vacation. Now, if you're having some trouble figuring out what you want to do on your summer vacation, I would suggest going and looking at this past Friday's Shenanigan with B, because it is everything beach related, and so she might give you some more ideas of what you can do in your meantime. Now, have you guys ever gotten really frustrated at an app for not loading? And then, because I know that I will, after 2 or 3 seconds, quit out of the app, refresh it a bunch of times, and keep on doing that until it finally loads. And I sometimes really wish that we could do that with life. I mean, if things aren't going our way, if life just stops working the way that it's supposed to, I wish I could just refresh it and keep on doing that until all of the problems are fixed. But unfortunately, we don't have something like that. But what happens when something comes up in our life that we can't fix right away? And I'm talking about difficulties. I'm talking about pain, struggle, and problems. The things that happen to us, and when we're in the middle of it, it's just really rough. Now, for the past few weeks, we've been talking about this question: what to do when you don't know what to do. And I really like this sermon because I think it's really relevant. And today we're talking about what to do when people make fun of you, when your learning disability makes learning that much harder and everything more difficult, when maybe you just recently failed a class in school, or you're in the middle of your parents' divorce, or someone you love gets really sick, or maybe you're in the middle of a pandemic here. Now, things that aren't easy, that you want to ask yourself, why? Why is this happening to me specifically? Why am I going through this? Why is this happening right now? And why can't it just be over already? Difficulties often feel random, pointless, or unnecessary. And when we watch a movie, we often watch the main character go through some type of difficult circumstance, some type of pain that in the end we see how much that they grew and moved past that time in their life. And we get to watch them have a happy ending after all of their hardships are resolved. But in real life, unlike the movies, or our difficult circumstances usually don't get a pretty bow tied on top, and we just get to walk away from them like nothing happened. The outcome may not turn out how we want them to. And in those times, it can be really difficult to see the other side, to find hope despite the hurt, or to find determination to keep on going despite difficulties. We can often find ourselves asking over and over again, when is this just going to be over? It's hard being in a place that doesn't get better overnight. It's hard being in a place where we wish that the answer to our problems were just one click away, or hoping that it'll just blow over in a week and past the weekend it'll be done. But when we find life confusing or difficult, we can actually learn what we can do by looking to people who have handled similar situations. And that's where we're going to go back to the story of Joseph that we've been in the past couple of weeks. Now, we've been looking at some events in Joseph's life over the past couple of weeks, and I'm going to give you a quick recap of his life. So basically, up until the point that we're going to talk about today, Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers. He was taken to a foreign country called Egypt, and where he was forced to work for a high, powerful official called Potiphar, and he was falsely accused of doing something that he didn't do, and he was thrown into prison. So from free man to prisoner, if anyone had the right to ask, why is this all happening to me? When is it going to be over? It was definitely Joseph. And that's where we pick up. So Joseph is in jail for a crime that he didn't commit. And it's in jail that he meets some new friends. So he actually meets the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of the Pharaoh, who were thrown into prison for offending him. So the Pharaoh ruled over all of Egypt. So if he wanted someone thrown in prison because they made him a little bit angry, he could do that. And the story continues. So we're in Genesis 40, verses 4 through 8. So it says here, after they had been in custody for some time, so that could be a long time or a short amount of time. So Joseph was actually in jail for a little bit longer than even these two people were. So each of the two men had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked the Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And so there's a lot happening here. Remember, Joseph is in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And even in this really difficult situation, Joseph is actually honoring God within prison. And so the men naturally told Joseph their dreams like he asked them to. And with God's help, Joseph told them what they meant. So Joseph told the cupbearer that his dream meant that he would be restored back to his original position with the Pharaoh. And he told the chief chef, that he would end up being killed. And then what Joseph said would happen actually happened. The cupbearer actually ended up being restored to his position and sat at the right hand of the Pharaoh. And the chef, well, it wasn't a very happy ending for him. But you would think, given that what Joseph had done to help the cupbearer out, it would have made sense for the cupbearer to speak up and say something to the Pharaoh and help Joseph out in return for getting him out of jail. But that's actually not what happened. Guys, the cupbearer actually forgot about Joseph, and he just went on with his life like nothing had ever happened. Just think about how Joseph felt. Over time, as Joseph was waiting in jail for his friend that he had met in jail to remember him, he realized that not only did his friend forget him, but what he did to help his friend out of the situation didn't even matter. There was no point to it because he was still in jail. And I'm sure he was tempted to wonder, what was the point of all of that? Has God forgotten about me too? When will this even end? But guys, it wasn't until 2 years later that the Pharaoh had two dreams that troubled him and needed interpretation. And that's when the cupbearer remembered him and told the Pharaoh about Joseph. So the Pharaoh called for Joseph, who interpreted the dream with incredible accuracy, just like he did with the cupbearer and the chef. And as a result, eventually, Joseph was made second in command of all of Egypt. So there was a Pharaoh who ruled over all of Egypt, and then there was Joseph right there second in command. The only person that was over him was the Pharaoh. So under Joseph's leadership, Egypt actually survived a terrible famine, which eventually put Egypt in a position to be able to save Joseph's family and other people from his homeland who were suffering from the famine. So it was a full 2 years before the cupbearer even remembered Joseph. And even when Joseph was promoted to a position of incredible power, guys, he was still in a very foreign country, very far away from home. And Joseph was still second in command under Pharaoh, but that meant if Pharaoh was having a bad day and he wanted Joseph dead, he could just make it happen like that. It was that quick. So it didn't make Joseph's life perfect. It didn't even make it close to perfect. But when we see the big picture and understand the context of the backstory, we see that Joseph's challenging circumstances uniquely positioned him to do something great. But Joseph still had to wait 2 full years. Do you even remember what 2018 was like? Because I definitely can't. Now, being promoted to second in command didn't undo the challenges he faced leading up to that. It didn't undo everything that he had gone through up until that point. But at the same time, God was able to work through these difficult circumstances, positioning Joseph and preparing him for something great, something that only he could do. And the same is true for you and me. Hard things can happen in your life, but friends, it is so important to remember that just because something happens doesn't mean it's something God did to you or wanted for you. As we look out into the world and to where we're somehow still fighting systemic racism, we can start to wonder what God is doing and if things are even going to get better. And it's so easy to ask ourselves, if God is working for my good and he is with me, then why does he still let bad things happen to me? Why is he still letting it happen for so long? And I so wish I could give the simple answer to that. But because we have free will and because sin exists in the world, things happen that aren't fair and things happen that don't make sense. people hurt each other and they create systems of hurt. But when it seems like it's impossible for anything good to come out of a situation, remember, guys, God is really good at doing the impossible. God parted the seas to lead an entire nation out of slavery and out of Egypt, but that didn't happen overnight, and things weren't perfect after that either. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." And it may not seem to make things all better, and it may not even make sense yet, but friends, God is in the business of taking our hurt, difficulties, and pain and redeeming them in his time. So it means that when you don't know what to do, you have to trust that God is working for your good. When you don't know what to do, you have to remember that your problems can position you for a purpose. And this doesn't mean we can tie a pretty little bow on everything bad. It doesn't mean everything will be fixed and go back to being how it was before everything bad happened. It doesn't mean that systemic racism will end next week after everything that we're already doing. It just means that we can leave room for God to tell a new story in our hard circumstances. And it means we can have confidence in God's ability to redeem things, to know that good can come from bad. And it means that the bad stuff doesn't get to have the last word. The hardest and the worst things we experience aren't the end of our story, guys. So when we're in the middle of difficulties and pain and we can't see the other side, what do? How can we trust that God is working for our good? Well, we can start by remembering the good that God has done in the past. And we could do this by two ways. We can, one, read scripture. Guys, there is story after story in the Bible of ways that God has shown up in the hurt and pain in people's lives and turned it into good. Start by aligning your hope in the truth that of those stories, and that it will be the same for you and I today, that he will do the same for you and I today. And two, ask others where they have seen God do good. So ask people like your small group leaders or your parents to tell you about a time in their life when they have seen God show up and bring good from the bad, but it may not have happened right away, or it may not have happened for a while. And ask them for their advice on how they trusted God and held on to the hope that it would turn out good, okay, and good in the end. Because sometimes when bad things happen, it doesn't get better the way that we want it to, and it doesn't get better in the amount of time that we want it to. Joseph went through pain that felt endless and pointless. But when we see the bigger picture, we see that God used his problems and positioned him for a purpose. God took his impossibly bad situation and used it to create unimaginable good in the future and ultimately down the road. But it didn't happen right away, and it didn't happen in the way that Joseph thought it would. I want you to remember that when we are in situations that are confusing and uncomfortable and sometimes scary, as we continue to engage in conversations and join the fight of the Black Lives Matter movement, trust that God hasn't given up and God is working, even if it's taking longer than we want. When you don't know what to do, believe me when I say that God is working for your good. Will you pray with me? God, you were so good in showing up in our difficult circumstances. I know that it is so hard to remember that when we're deep in that pain and in that difficulty and in that time to where we don't see the other side and we don't see the light, you are so good in showing up in that. God, when we are in those times of pain, can you give us a sign to let us know that you're there? Just give us some hope to be able to get through that time, because we know that you are working for our good in those situations ultimately. We know that you are a kind God and that you love us unconditionally. God, I know that times are scary right now, and even it might be scary because of not anything that's going on. It might not be scary because of the pandemic, might not be scary because of systemic racism and everything going on, but it might be scary because people are going through things that are scary to themselves and don't have anything to do with that. God, will you show up in their lives, and will you bring them out of that darkness, and will you help them get through that other side no matter how long it takes? God, we love you, and we love that you are here for our good. In your name I pray, amen. Okay, guys, have a fun time at small groups.